unique opportunity. I really appreciate it. And also to get this exciting mix of people together, and to the many helpers made this possible. And thanks for Tajikistan for making this conference available to us. About myself, I'm a foreign correspondent, reporter for the German news magazine Der Spiegel, and I have been covering wars that have been and continue to be heavily influenced by Islamist actors for 30 years. When Dr. Moranian asked me to moderate this panel, I asked, what are we going to talk about? About dreams? Islamist extremism is on the rise worldwide, becoming more, not less. But of course, he quite rightly pointed out to me that the absolute majority of Muslims have different ideas about
افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر متوازن او پر وخت خبرو د خبري پیښو راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر متوازن او پر وخت خبرو د خبري پیښو راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ.
کانال تلگرام 8 صبح را دنبال کنید. ما تازه ترین رویدادهای خبری افغانستان، منطقه و جهان را به گونه موثق، متوازن و با موقع پوشش می دهیم. برای دسترسی آسان به رویدادهای خبری، گزارش‌ها و تحلیل‌ها، کانال 8 صبح را در تلگرام دنبال کنید و به اشتراک بگذارید.
They are feeding young Muslims around
من اون خوردن خورد ندارم. چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختی
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از دامنه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب، اسپاتیفای، اپل میوزیک، گوگل پادکست و تریدز، خبرهای تازه، گزارش‌های ویژه، مستندهای کوتاه و تحلیل‌ها را در قالب پادکست و مخاطبان ارائه می‌کند. رویدادها بر سرنوشت شما تأثیر می‌گذارند. آنچه را می‌بینید و آنچه را می‌دانید روایت کنید. 8 صبح، روایت دیروز، آینه امروز، نوید فردا.
All right. Maybe you join us later then. To introduce our panelists, so we're already briefly introduced. To my right, Ambassador Mohammed Mohik, Islamic Studies scholar from Afghanistan. To my left, the very well-known Dr. Michael Rubin, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, most likely one of the people who have studied Afghanistan from all sides and angles as almost nobody else. Mr. Mustafa Akyol is unfortunately not with us personally, but he will send us a video message right after this introduction. And Mr. Kadir Malikov from Kyrgyzstan, which is in particular interesting because the rise of the extremist ideas and interpretations in Central Asia are a very big concern for many. And actually, usually ladies first, but Ms. Nasreen Gross in particular asked me to call on her only in the very end, which I do. But I think before we start now, we will going to hear the video with Mr. Mustafa Akyol, who is a writer and journalist from Cato Institute in Turkey, who has written books with a beautiful title like, why is that? Why, what, hold on. I noted it because I found it really remarkable. Why, as a Muslim, I defend liberty and Islam with no extremism, with no extremes. So if we could hear him, see him now, would that be possible?
Greetings and salams to دوشنبه, and thanks to the organizers of this important conference there, the Herat Security Dialogue. Thanks for them to invite me to this event as well. I wish I could join in person, but this is the best we could do for now. Now, my work is about the place of Islam in the modern world, the idea of freedom and human rights in the Islamic tradition and the contemporary Muslim world. And a part of that has been the study of this political ideology called Islamism and its impact in the world. That includes Afghanistan, that includes Iran, that includes parts of the Arab world. And we should first define what Islamism is. Islam, of course, is a religion that has been there since more than 14 centuries. It began in the early 7th century when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, began to preach a message of monotheism, and out of that came the great Islamic civilization and this world's second largest religion. But Islamism is a more recent term. It was spoken, it became a fashionable term in the 20th century. People began to speak about Islamism after 1920s. The reason for that is actually understandable. In the 20th century, first with Western colonial advances, Western colonialism, which dominated parts of the Arab world, parts of Southeast Asia, and also later came Russian colonialism too, not just colonialism. It's not just a Western problem. These foreign forces occupied different parts of the Muslim world, which made many Muslims understandably defensive and looking for a way out, way forward, a way of resistance. On top of that, there came Arab dictatorships or different dictatorships in the Muslim world, and certain Muslims who felt threatened by these regimes also looked for an answer. And different answers have been offered. Some Muslims found the answer in nationalism, others in socialism. Some of them found the answer in what I would think as the better approach, which is political liberalism combined with economic rationality and economic development. My home country, Turkey, has, I think, tilted towards that, at least in certain times of the past 100 years, and it has been good for Turkey generally. That includes joining the European, trying to join the European Union and trying to incorporate some of the criteria of the European Union, like democracy, rule of law, free markets, freedom of speech and religion, and so on and so forth. But Islamists had a different idea. They thought that, and by Islamists we can mention the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was founded in the late 1920s, still happens to be the main Islamist movement, which has been also too much persecuted, we should say that. And that led to some of the radical offshoots of that group. But besides Muslim Brotherhood, there has been a movement of Islamism in Southeast Asia. Sayyid Abu Ala Mawdudi was the key figure, the key thinker in the subcontinent, and different parts of Islamist movements. And ultimately, some of these Islamists turned into governments. In Iran, we've had that with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which created the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in Afghanistan, with the chaos of the Soviet invasion and the post-Soviet civil conflict, civil war, came for the Taliban, the group called the Taliban, which took control of Afghanistan in the 90s. And then again, after the NATO pullout, after the US pullout in the past few years. Now, I don't need to explain to anybody, I think here in this conference, what the Taliban is or what their approach is, or what that may bring for the future of Afghanistan. But from an Islamic point of view, I would like to share a few thoughts, which is not just about the Taliban, but it's relevant for Iran, and it's also relevant for other Islamist movements throughout the Muslim world, which may be in power or which may be trying to come to power, which may be in power in a certain area, like the Aceh province of Indonesia or parts of Kenya, or which may have Islamized the regime to some extent, as we have seen in Afghanistan, Pakistan, as Pakistan has its own Islamization of laws with the push from Islamist groups, and still have certain laws enacted by them. Now, Islamists typically believe that for the Muslims to regain their lost glory in the early centuries of Islam, to become a powerful and independent civilization again, to defeat whoever they see as the enemies of Muslims, they must revive the true Islam. That's one thing, and I think that's probably a broad goal that's shared by other groups as well. But also they must bring that true Islam, as they define it, to power. It must be the basis of government. So they want to create Islamic states and Islamic regimes. Now, is this something new in Islam? Yes and no. Of course, in Islam, from the beginning, we had Prophet Muhammad establish a state in Medina, then came the Khilafah, that's the Caliphate. So you had states like the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Ottomans that you could call Islamic states because they were implementing the Islamic law, but they were not like exactly like in the Islamist utopia. First of all, they implemented Islamic law, but Islamic law was less centralized at the time. States did not have one territory on which they imposed a certain law, so there was more pluralism within Islam. There were non-Muslims who could follow their own convictions, or own religious traditions. Jews and Christians had their own legal systems. And also, when you go back to the Ottoman Empire, you don't have a concept called Islamic economy, which is a part of, for example, Islamic tradition. They didn't necessarily think that the House of Osman, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman dynasty, they didn't call it an Islamic state. They call it the Devlet Ali or Devlet Ali Islam Osmaniye, which is the Ottoman state. So it was named after one dynasty. The whole idea of this new modern state with all its education, single law of the land that is going to be imposed on every citizen, and to Islamize this, to make it Islamic and take one idea, one interpretation of Islam and make it the official doctrine, that is in that sense a modern idea. That's why when you read ideologues of Islamism like Sayyid Qutb or Al-Mawdudi or Hassan al-Banna, they have new ideas, actually. They have modern ideas, but modern ideas that actually have been inspired from sometimes fascism, sometimes from communism. Certainly Khomeini was inspired certain ideas of communism. Now, so that's one problem, but in practical terms, there is a few more problems with Islamism. I think the most important thing is, by their ambition to Islamize the state, they are taking their own understanding of it and imposing on everybody else, which we clearly see in the Taliban case. The Taliban believe that, for example, one, everybody speaks about women, which is very important. I mean, they are imposing on women what they believe as the right norm, and they're depriving women from the right to have education, the right to travel, many other rights. But just another simple example, the Taliban believe that music is haram. That is, you shouldn't listen to music if you're a good Muslim. Now, in a liberal secular state, a Muslim who believes music is haram can perfectly live by that idea. How? you don't listen to music in your home or you don't play in your car, you're good. But the Taliban wants to make everybody not listen to music. So they take the idea, their idea that music is haram, and impose it on everybody else. That's why they were breaking cassette players in the 90s. And now we know they've been going after musicians and also trying to, in different ways, impose that idea of theirs. Or the Taliban believe that all Muslim would be veiled. Well, Muslim women who think that they should be veiled have all the right to do so, and I'll be supportive of that. It's their religious freedom. But other Muslim women think that it's not necessary to wear a hijab or let alone a niqab. They think a normal dress is modest enough. A more common dress is modest enough. And they should be able to right to choose that. So if we had a actually secular liberal state under which if you want to wear a niqab, you can wear it. If you don't want to wear it, you don't wear it. And that's the right way. And that is the only way to make it religiously meaningful. Because if you impose one interpretation of Islam as the state's directive, it's not God's command anymore. It's the state's command. Instead of that, people should be able to practice Islam as they believe in it with their own conscience, with their free choice. That's why I believe there is a fundamental incompatibility between the idea of an Islamic state that imposes what it understands as Islam to society with sincere piety. It's because when you impose people something they don't want to do, it's not worship anymore. It's not piety anymore. It often leads to hypocrisy. It can even lead to actually counterproductive results. One thing we see in Iran is that the more the Iranian regime impose on society things that they think Islamically are required, they didn't make the society religious, more religious. They made the society less religious. Today, many polls show that the Iranian society has become quite secular, less observant than before. There are many Iranians who have actually converted from Islam. They have become atheists, or some of them converted into Christianity, of course, secretly in Iran, because that's a crime. Many of them have fled to the West. And visitors to Tehran observe that, society has become growingly less religious, less respectful to religion, precisely because it is imposed on them. So not every movement, Islamist movement may be willing to go to the point of the Taliban or Iran, but these examples should be a wake-up call for us Muslims that the ideal way of government that we Muslims need in the modern world is not a government that will say, this is Islamic, and will dictate what its narrow understanding of Islam on everybody. Instead, what we need is governments that will protect the freedom and the security and the rights of every individual, every human being, so they can choose to be pious, so they can live their religion as they want, whatever sect they are following. Or if they're not pious, it's still their choice. It's between them and God, and you cannot make them pious by forcing them. So I think Islamism basically goes against the Quranic principle of La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion. They bring in a lot of compulsion in religion. And that's not good for religion. That's not good for society. We clearly see that in Afghanistan. Of course, years will show how long this experiment will last. But I think we should not lose hope for having Muslim majority states where we have freedom as the foundation of that state, freedom and security and justice, under which people can be pious in the way they want to be, which is the, I think, right way to be religious. Thank you again for inviting me for this conference, and sorry that I couldn't join in person. Inshallah, as we say, maybe sometime in the future. And greetings to everybody who were kind enough to listen to me, and many salams.
So thank you very much that we finally heard some enlightening words of Mustafa Akyol. Actually, he stole your time. Unfortunately, it was not only an introductory note, but also actually a lecture. But a lecture we can take a lot from. I start with you, Michael, sitting on my left side. As I mentioned before, we now stick in Afghanistan for a moment. Even we want to talk about a broader picture of Islam and Islamism and how it can be liberated, the beliefs can be liberated, and what is the ideal foundation of a liberal idea of Islam. You have been, I don't know how many times you traveled to Afghanistan, most likely a couple of hundreds of times. And how would you describe the situation in Afghanistan today? Of the now, let's say 40 million Afghans in Afghanistan, how many Afghans there today are still traditionally conservative? How many are now ideologically oriented and follow extreme interpretations of the Deobandis or even Al-Qaeda, which once had their origins in the Muslim Brotherhood? And how many still follow the sheer spirituality of Islam, which is traditional but apolitical, poetic, and at the end, very personal?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take the academic prerogative to say what I want, and I will answer your question as I say it. I also want to start by thanking Dr. Davoud Moradian, but I don't want to thank Davoud for this conference. Rather, what I want to do is focus attention on how bold he has been and how much behind the scenes he has done far beyond the confines of these conferences, and really put his neck out there in a way that few are bold enough to do. And so for that, in addition to the conference, I want to thank Dr. Moradian. The way I'm going to interpret this question, because the answer is simple, I don't know the current situation in terms of the numbers of Afghans. What I do know is what Mustafa, a friend from back in Washington, has related, in that people are no longer, of course, free to practice Islam the way they wish to. And at the same time, what the Taliban are doing is trying to impose an interpretation which is foreign to Afghanistan. What I want to dedicate my remarks to would be understanding how the policy community inadvertently, through our own biases, often plays into Taliban hands. So I'm going to focus specifically on what I know best, which is how Washington sometimes becomes its own worst enemy. Let me start by saying, again, I'm not only going to talk about Afghanistan here, but also my experiences in Iraq and in Syria with the Islamic State. The first thing I would argue when it comes to Washington's approach to this extremist Islamism is that too often political correctness constrains the way the United States approaches the problem. We don't want to insult Islamic sensibilities. And at the same time, we confuse extremism with authenticity. We see this, for example, in some State Department brochures, which talk about Islam in America, and 90% of the photos of women are showing themselves wearing hair covering, where 90% of American Muslim women do not wear hair covering. So why are we imposing this notion of this interpretation, which is more extreme than the actual practice? Part of the problem in American political and policy culture is the third rail of our separation between church and state, between mosque and state. What that means in practice, and I experienced this when I worked in the Pentagon a few decades ago, is that we don't want to touch religion at all. But that's not the way the world works. Religion is a factor, and when you're in Afghanistan, maybe not in the military bases, but among ordinary people, or when you're in Iraq, or when you're in Syria, religion is a factor. The question isn't whether it's Islam or not Islam. The question is what the people who are suffering in those regions acknowledge, which is we're facing a debate within Islam. We can't simply ignore religion, and we can't ignore that the problem, that criticizing the situation isn't criticizing Islam. We have to acknowledge the debates which are ongoing, and even though the United States doesn't have a role in determining the outcome of those debates, there are ways in which external powers can try to put their finger on the scale. For example, when Saadettin Ibrahim was arrested back in 2002 in Egypt for having said that there's very little difference between autocracy and theocracy, that the autocrats use the mechanisms of state to repress people, and the theocrats use the mechanisms of the religious infrastructure to oppress people, that the only thing they agree on is squashing out the liberal alternative, which might try to emerge in between. He was arrested by the Mubarak regime, and the Bush administration held up $120 million worth of aid in order to successfully compel his release. We've had the opposite. For example, in debates with regard to reverse abrogation, when those who are making those debates in Sudan were executed, and the Western world simply sat on the sidelines because we didn't want to intercede in or offer opinions in anything dealing with religion. Now, I visited the Taliban in the year 2000, driving from Jalalabad to Kandahar. And subsequently, much more recently, I've visited both Mosul and the former Islamic State capital of Raqqa. And I was able in each place to interview people. And what becomes clear is that those who suffer under Islamic extremism are, in this case, the Sunni Muslims themselves. And therefore, it's ridiculous and counterproductive to suggest that somehow by acting in a restrained fashion in these debates, that somehow we're being sensitive to religion. Actually, we're helping the perpetrators against the victims if we refrain from criticizing the extreme nature of some strains of these religious debates. And I saw this also when I used to teach for the US military. It was easy to get figures on so-called green on blue violence. When some Afghan soldier would turn his gun and kill members of NATO who were training with them or in the same unit. But it was almost impossible to get the figures of green on green violence. When some Afghan soldier would be penetrated by the Taliban and would turn his gun on his colleagues who are fighting for freedom of all Afghans, men and women, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religiosity. The figures of green on green violence were at a minimum 3 times as high. Okay, I'll be very quick. We have to ignore the state sponsorship of terrorism and not ignore that everything is organic or indigenous. It's ridiculous to say Pakistan had no role sponsoring the Taliban, and it's ridiculous to say that Turkey had no role in facilitating the Islamic State. We can't confuse access with wisdom. The case in point here would be Zalmay Khalilzad, who I would argue became the useful idiot of the ISI. Because the ISI gave him exclusive access, he was able to sell that back in Washington. It's condescending and racist to conflate the Taliban and Islam, the Taliban and Pushtun culture, and the Taliban and Afghan culture. So in answer to your question and to conclude, the issue isn't how many Afghans right now want a better future. I would say the majority of them do, the vast majority. The question is, what mistakes is the United States and more broadly the international community making, which actually reinforces and infuses the Taliban with legitimacy that they in no way deserve? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was certainly brilliant, and didn't perfectly ask my question, but I don't allow you to escape from that totally. One very brief, but really brief answer. I mean, the path. What is happening? Sorry.
Oh, we've got a manager.
What is? Yeah, sure. Sure. Okay. Sorry, I didn't get this. Where is he? Dr. Hassan?
Has now been added to the.
Oh, yes. Is he in the room, Dr. Hassan Abu Talib? He's there. Would you come to the panel, please? That would be fantastic. Where is he? He's coming. Fantastic. Yes. Great. Very sorry that was not introduced on the screen. That was a technical mistake, and we apologize. Thank you for joining. Yes. Until he arrives. So the path to extremism has been described very often, but the way out of it, how can it be organized? You have 1.5 minutes.
So very quickly, how can it be organized? There's a number of strains of thought within Islamic reformism, which I think need to be amplified. One is whether, for example, the Medinan verses should abrogate the Meccan verses or vice versa. Another one is whether the Quran as interpreted, since the Quran is eternal, whether it should be interpreted or how we differentiate 6th century AD Muslim culture, Arab culture, from much more broader Islamic culture. Can we interpret it as a living document through Iranian eyes, through Turkish eyes, through Indian eyes, and so forth? And that brings us to what we can do to empower. There is more freedom of religion in the United States and Europe, freedom of Islamic thought, than in many Islamic countries. Likewise, when we promote interfaith dialogue, we need to promote among the Muslim community the women, the surgeons, the businessmen, and not simply relate the focus of the dialogue to a self-described mullah. We have to recognize the broad nature of the Islamic community, and that's how it's empowerment, which is the answer. That's where we can chime in.
Thank you very much. I mean, thank you very much, Michael. I mean, we all know that this is not a simple thing to do. I mean, to reach out to the women, I mean, you usually need to have the permission of the men, but that's
I'm saying in the United States.
In the United States, all right. Dr. Hassan Abu Talib, thank you for joining us. I would like to jump to a topic that many have discussed as a very fundamental argument. You as a researcher at the Al-Ahram Center of Political and Strategic Studies in Egypt, you are a consultant, you're an academic advisor, you are a columnist. Many believe that there is a contradiction between to defend freedom of the individual and adhere to the Islamic faith. Would you agree on that, or would you think there is no contradiction? It goes very well together.
Contradiction between what and what?
Sorry?
He's asking me to repeat.
Oh, the question. There's the two factors are there are many who would say Islamic faith and the individual liberty of individuals does not go well together. Democracy and Islam is not really something which goes together well. Would you agree on that, or would you say that's nonsense?
You ask me about a very, very delicate situation, delicate issue.
Can you go closer to the microphone so people can hear you well?
This is a very, very delicate issue which can't answer yes or no. You have to understand first what is the meaning of Islam, real Islam. We have now different versions of Islam adopted by the Muslim community according to different variables. And in the same times, in Islam itself, he keep what we can say the right of freedom and also the right of ownership, and they get the persons the right to discover their own future, their own capabilities without any obstacles or any strain, except believing in God, believing in Quran, believing in a Sunnah adopted by Prophet Muhammad. We here speak about the real Islam, which keep the realities, all the rights of the persons. When they asked me to make a presentation in this panel, I focused on this terms, civilizational Islam. Can you tell me, did you know whom creates this concept and whom played the role to put a differentiation between the traditional Islam and the civilizational Islam? Is there anybody knows this intellectual creates this concept?
And
Since what?
I'm sure not everybody is familiar with it. Depends on.
Okay. This is okay. And this is what I asked myself when they asked me to make a banner or to make a speech about this issue.
A speech, I'm afraid we are not.
No, not a long one. Not a long. I have a paper. I will.
Unfortunately, we don't have very much time. But if you keep it very brief, certainly the floor is yours.
Yes, that's right. That's good.
Brief means like 3 to 5 minutes
very,
maximum.
Very brief. About 1 hour? Or
about 3 to 5 minutes maximum.
how?
3 to 5 minutes maximum. Okay. Better 3 than 5.
Okay. Now, the issue of Afghanistan create a very, very problematic issue. Not only for the Afghan people.
Can you go very close to the microphone, please? People don't hear you.
Very close to the microphone.
Yes, that's much better.
Yes. This is not sensitive one, so it anyway. When the institute asked me to participate in this panel, I asked myself, why the institute choose this concept, civilizational Islam? I think this is not the issue of Afghanistan itself. This is the issue of all the Muslim countries, all the Muslim societies, how to create a model of Islam related to the origins of Islam in itself. This is related to many, many things. First of all, this is related to what we can say is the failure of all the development and Renaissance models adopted in most of the Arab countries, most of the Muslim countries. This is create some kind of frustration for the people, and also make a gap between the people themselves and the government. Then another thing, if we look to the most of the development and the Renaissance adopted in the Muslim Arab and Arab countries, it created from outside. We need to bring our own side, from inside our tradition, correct tradition related to the good interpretation for the Sunnah and the Quran. And this is give some space for what we can say the extremists to create their own privilege and their own influence on the Muslim societies, because they expose themselves as the correct Islam against all this failed Renaissance and development experience in the Arab countries. And unfortunately, there were some Muslim institutions, official institutions, they didn't confront such bad and negative interpretation raised by those Islamic groups. And we have to put in our mind two different types of the major Islamic groups. One, what we can say, local one. It tries to play a role inside a certain Muslim community. And the other one is the cross-border organization like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, which try to make some kind of a change, not only in the local societies, but also in the international system, international regime, creating the caliphate state. This is the major and the obstacles which they try to adopt it in a certain place and they try to spread it to other places and to the other communities.
Dr. Abu Talib, you just pointed out something very important, that they didn't stand up against these radical ideas. So why? Because they were violent. It's not that they ignore it. It's not that they don't care. They are afraid. So
afraid?
They are afraid. The radical Islamists are threatening more liberal ideas, and that's a threat people withdraw from.
I don't understand this problematic vision you raise now.
Okay. I mean, you have seen this. You have witnessed it in your own country, when the Muslim Brothers ruled Egypt for a very short period of time. We don't know what would have happened if the military hadn't seized power. I mean, we don't know. The result is not a good one either, as we can see. And the question is, do the idea of liberal democracy in Islam, how do they go together in a country like Egypt?
Look, you can say that the Muslim Brotherhood is the origin of all the Muslim Islamic organization, even those who violent one or the peaceful one. Because if you know the whole concept which the Muslim Brotherhood adopted or raised by Imam Hassan al-Banna, who is created the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. He put himself as the first step to create a Muslim society, and then a state, a Muslim state, and then caliphate empire. And this concept is about to be spread in all the mentalities of the Islamic groups, not only in Egypt, but in everywhere, seeking to create caliphate state. But the major difference between whom are local one and the cross-border one is the local one concentrate and focus in making an Islamic government according to their interpretation for only a local society. The other not like that. The other trying to spread. Here it doesn't for them the matter of Islam and democracy. This is a matter of creating a Muslim and an Islamic government according to their interpretation, which is not famous, is not acceptable by the other faction in the society. This is not a matter of democracy here. This is a matter of creating a model, a correct model of interpretation based upon the original concept of Quran and the Sunnah.
Thank you very much. Great. Yeah, that's absolutely worth an applause. Thank you very much, Dr. Abu Talib. There was something in your speech which I found remarkable. You said something about the frustration in the Arabic or in the Islamic people. So I'm wondering what factor that plays. Ambassador Mohek, where does the susceptibility of young people in Pakistan and Afghanistan and other countries that you observe to this extreme way of life come from? Why does it not seem attractive to be self-determined, to lead a life in which you make your own decisions, to choose your own partner, for example? I have two questions. That's the simple one.
Thank you, Mr. Dr. Muradian and other friends.
Can you speak a little bit louder, please?
Yeah. If you allow me, I prefer to speak Farsi.
Sure.
Is it okay?
Absolutely.
To change a little bit the atmosphere, switch to the language I'm more fluent.
Sure.
سوال پرسیدن که جوان ها همونطور که درست فهمیده باشم چرا نسل جوان در افغانستان، در پاکستان و شاید در بخش دیگر از سرزمین های مسلمان نشین در آسیای میانه هم و جاهای دیگر در جنوب آسیا، اینا به جایی که به یک زندگی علاقمند باشن که در او استقلالیت اراده باشه و در او فردیت مطرح باشه، به طرف ایدئولوژی های افراطی کشیده می شوند. Did I understand the question correctly?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, go ahead.
من فکر میکنم، یعنی باور من این است که زوایای مختلفی ارتباط با پدیده اکستریمیسم یا افراطیت وجود داره که بخشی از اونا در صحبت‌های دوستان اشاره شد و قبل از این از صبح که ما بحث میکردیم مشکلی که در مورد طالبان است در ظاهر مشکل افغانستان است، اما در واقع این مثل قله یک کوه یخ است که از آب بیرون زده و بخش‌های وسیع‌تر از کشورهای اسلامی در معرض این مشکل قرار دارند و تنها کشورهای اسلامی هم نه بلکه کمیونیتی های مسلمانی که در مهاجرت هستند هم بخش آسیب پذیر یا وولنربل هستند در معرض این قضیه قرار دارند که بخشی از جوانها کشیده میشن به طرف افراطیت. حال چه عوامل به این قضیه کمک میکنه؟ یک زاویه که برای من مهم است میخوایم بر او تاکید کنم که اتفاقا به این پنل ما ارتباط میگیره، مسئله شکست تمدنی مسلمانان در 2 قرن اخیر. یعنی ما یک رنسانس را شروع کردیم از پایان قرن 18 و از آغاز قرن 19. این رنسانس در چند کشور مسلمان برای افتاد، در مصر زمان محمد علی پاشا، در ترکیه اواخر عثمانی، در ایران، در میان مسلمانان هند سر سید احمد خان در شبه قاره هند. اینها شروع کردن یک روندی که رنسانس برای کشورهای مسلمان بود. اما این رنسانس به او شکلی که در اروپا با موفقیت به پیش رفت همون مسیر نتوانست طی کنه و با افت و خیزهای زیاد همراه بود و یکی از نتایج این شکست یا افت و خیزهای شدید اکستریمیسم یا پدیده‌ای بود که ما امروز با او دست به گریبانیم. در اینجا 2 یا 3 عامل میشه به شکل جدی در نظر گرفت. یک، عامل داخلی که مربوط به کلچر و تمدن و وضعیت درونی جوامع اسلامی است. دوم، عامل الटरनेटिव्ی که باید ارائه میشد برای یعنی راهکار یا راه حل‌هایی که برای عبور از بحران پیشنهاد میشد توسط گروه‌های مختلف که بعضی دوستان اشاره کردن، مثل سوسیالیسم یا نشنالیسم یا راهکارهای دیگر که یک از اینا اسلامیسم بود. سوم، عاملی که بسیار مهم است که در محاسبات باید در نظر گرفته شود، این که رنسانس وقتی در یک منطقه به راه میفته آیا با مزاحمت‌های بیرونی هم همراه است یا ای که بیشتر به دینامیک داخلی خود تکیه داره؟ اگر این را با رنسانس اروپا در مقایسه کنیم.
Dr. Ambassador,
2 minutes.
Ambassador Mike.
2 minutes.
Yes, maybe you want to include the question how this renaissance of the Islamic civilization could be revived and what factors could lead to that revitalization?
بر اساس تجربه تاریخی ما در کشورهای اسلامی یک دوره از شکوفایی تمدنی ما تجربه کردیم که بر اساس کلندر مسلمانان قرن 2 قرن 3 و قرن 4 و قرن 5 وقت شکوفایی تمدن اسلامی است، وقتی که در همین سرزمین در همین منطقه ما و شما ابن سینا ظهور کرده، در غرب ابسینا میگن، در اون سمت جهان اسلام ابن رشد ظهور کرده، خوارزمی ظهور کرده. یک دوره تمدنی است، یعنی ای که یک پتانسیل وجود داشت در جهان اسلام که یک شکوفایی تمدنی به وجود بیاید. در این دوره ما با یک مشکل جدی که مواجه بودیم این بود که در یک سطح دینامیک داخلی کشورهای اسلامی دچار یک کانفلیکت و درگیری درونی بود، از یک سو دیگه یک تمدن قدرتمندتری بود که حوادث داخلی کشورهای اسلامی مدیریت میکرد به سوی اهداف سیاسی و اقتصادی خود که نقش کلونالیسم یا استعمار نمیشه نادیده گرفت. یک از اون مهمتر نقش حمایت از اسلامیسم در دوران جنگ سرد. این به شکل آگاهانه از بخشی از جهان، از بیرون جهان اسلام دخالت جدی صورت گرفت. در وقتی که ضیاءالحق در پاکستان به قدرت رسید، در زمانی که انقلاب ایران اتفاق افتاد، در زمانی که جهاد افغانستان شروع شد، در زمانی که در سعودی جهیمان مکه مکرمه اشغال کرد، در زمانی که انور السادات در مصر از شوروی، از اتحاد جماهیر شوروی فاصله گرفت و به طرف غرب آمد. یعنی این عوامل متعدد دست به دست هم داد که ما با وضعیت روبرو هستیم که امروز ما او را به نام اکستریمیسم اسلامی میشناسیم. همه این عوامل را باید به همدیگر وصل کرد و فهمید که چرا ما به اینجا رسیدیم. اگر این ما تقلیل بدیم به یک عامل، دو عامل، عوامل خردی هست. فقر مثلا یک عامل است که جوانها به طرف افراطیت کشیده میشن. پایین بودن سطح سواد در جوامع مشکل هست. بیکاری، اینها مشکلات درجه دوست، مشکلاتی که پارادایم ایجاد میکنه. The big paradigm of in the world, who is leading this paradigm, who is creating this paradigm? The question is that the superpowers who are creating the international discourses in the world. در این سطح وقتی که موضوع بررسی می شود، ما بین عوامل درجه اول و عوامل درجه دو تفکیک کنیم، ببینیم چقدر، یعنی نتیجه‌ای که می‌خوایم، the conclusion، نتیجه‌ای که بخشی از این مسئولیت برمیگرده به اشتباهات و مشکلاتی که در داخل جوامع اسلامی وجود داشته، بخشی از این برمیگرده به سیاست‌های قدرت‌های کلان در وقت جنگ سرد که تا امروز هم ما کم و بیش شاهد او هستیم بین قدرت‌های کلان جهانی که اونها جریان‌های بزرگ مدیریت میکنن و اکستریمیسم در این فاصله ها و شکاف های کانفلیکت که بین قدرت ها با وجود میاد فرصت رشد پیدا میکنه.
Many things, Ambassador Nohek. And that was a very important insight into history, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm still looking for answers on not only what led to extremism, but also what leads out from extremism. Nazreen Gross, you've been living in the US for, I think, 30 years, but at the same time, you have been a professor long time ago at the University of Kabul, and at the same time, you came back, I think, during the time of the Republic on and off as a lecturer. You taught girls, and you had a dream. The dream was that they one day should be able to read their rights in the Constitution themselves. There's something which really interests me a lot, and it's a little bit delicate question, but what do you think? What role does gender relations play in the ideology of extremists, Islamist groups, in motivating young Muslims? In other words, the promise that men will be allowed to rule over women, over their whereabouts, their employment, their bodies, And in the event of their deaths, they will be rewarded with the offering of virgins as martyrs. How important is that in the concept of Islamism? And what does this concept, what the idea of gender relations does possibly be, how is it possibly replaced in post-Islamism, and why should that be attractive? I mean, it's actually two questions, but maybe you want to focus on the first, but also what is the way out from that concept? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So far, the discussion has been very, very learning for me. I learned a lot from everybody.
Can you take the
Yes, thank you. I want to thank Dr. Mouradian and Ali Nazari for alerting me about this conference and inviting me. And I asked you that I should talk last because I'm not a scholar and I'm not an academic. I'm somebody that knows how to write a book, and a few topics have interested me and I have done it. I'm a researcher, so to speak. The question you asked, let me ask the audience a question. If you have a society that is 90% illiterate, and you want to actually implement a constitution, how far do you get? You don't have to answer. I know the answer. This is exactly the same thing in Afghanistan as regards the Quran. I lived in Afghanistan for 19 years. And I worked not with the elites, but with the masses. And what I tell you is my own observation. I wrote a book called Women in the Quran. I wrote a book called Women in the Quran, and it has all the verses of the Quran that mention the word woman. I found out that in Afghanistan, nobody knew about this. Nobody had the presence of mind to remember all these verses. But I learned more than that. So it went through 4 printings. The first one was based on Muhaddis Dehlawi. The last 3 printings was based on Tafsir Nur by Khurram Del, who was a Kurd teaching in Iran at the university. Right now, I am using this book, one of the latest translations of the Quran into English, and it's one of the very best in order to have the English version of it. Now, let me tell you 4 points that my 19 years of living in Afghanistan and dealing with masses have taught me, and also the university and students and all that. You know, in Afghanistan, I want to look that way, but it's in Afghanistan, I think no more than 10% maximum of people can know Arabic enough to read the Quran and understand it. Our languages are Farsi, Pashto, Uzbeki, these things. So it's safe to say that 90% of Afghans, all their lives and for several centuries, they can read the Quran, but they do not understand what it means. What kind of a good Muslim can I be if I don't know what my own holy book says? The knowledge comes from the mullahs in my time, mullahs in mosques. So one of the best things for the new Afghanistan, this vision that you are looking at, for me, is actually to provide good translation of the Quran in Farsi or Pashto, if it exists. But in Farsi, I know it exists. I used one that was done in Malik Fahad's Institute in Medina. It's a pocket size. It's one side, a verse in Arabic, and the same next to it in Farsi. It's one of the best. I got 500 copies of it from the Saudi ambassador, and I distributed it among the mullahs and among some of civil society and some of my friends who were also thinking of Islam. Believe you me, many of the mullahs cried when I gave them this. They told me that was the first time they had read a translation. Yes, we have a lot of translations, but mullahs don't have the education or the money. So for the future successful Afghanistan, in order to provide people with this ability to decide for themselves, I suggest find 500,000 or 100,000 copies of this one translation and distribute it, especially among families, among teachers, professors. This, believe me, in 6 months, you will see a difference.
That's a wonderful idea, Nasreen. Thank you very much.
No, I have 3 more points. Please allow me.
All right. We really have to
I'm going to make it very short. I'll make each one. Yes, I'll make each one.
All right.
The second point I make is that, of course, if you are distributing 100,000 translation of the Quran, you need really literate people to read it. And that's where we have a problem right now. The girls, the Taliban are making them another generation of illiterates that cannot read the Quran. And the boys are not better. Okay, sure. We have to do this. The education, the new system must pay attention to the education. The third one is that be careful. The last 19 years was one of the most successful educational periods for Afghanistan, from a few thousand students at the beginning of Operation Enduring Freedom till 15th of August of 2021, when America left. On that day, there were more than 310,000 girls and boys in higher education institutions alone. That's a phenomenal achievement for the people of Afghanistan. But remember that their parents are mostly illiterate. So when we go back, we have to find ways of how to deal with these two generations. Finally,
that's the other point now.
The other point that I want to make is actually not about Afghanistan, but in the whole of the Muslim world. I think several of the people here that have talked about this tension that exists in the Arab world or in the Muslim Islamic world. We have a lot of conflict as a result of the different interpretations of Islam, as a result of the fact that this is the largest generation of Muslims who have read the Quran themselves. Now, what I suggest, and what it's my little mind that is thinking that would solve. One is to have a gathering of real scholars of Islam from many, many countries to get together and do a normalization, what we in sociology call normalization of data for translation, the minimum and maximum of something, so that we don't go with 500 different interpretations of hijab. Or there are many, many points in that is that way. And the other good thing that we really need, we have to develop as Muslims a full concordance of the Quran, but with all the ideas, modern ideas, a concordance of what in the Quran is in the United Nations documents or something like that. Those are those 3 or 4 things. They are by no means the only things. There are several others, but I think that these things will help the Muslims of Afghanistan at least feel more vulnerable in order to stand up to the machinations of extremism or whatever. Thank you.
Nazreen, thank you very much. Very valuable points. Really very much appreciated because it's so practical what you say. May I add that I learned that in Saudi Arabia there is a project of like something like 200 scholars from the Islamic world worldwide who exactly do that, go through the Quran and so yeah, the Sunnah to really find out what is still a fit for the today's world and which is actually not practical any longer. So there is guidance. What you're talking about is actually leadership. There is a lack of leadership. That's really sorry. We are really running out of time. I really appreciate your contributions, but Kadir Malikov, for instance, didn't say a word yet. He's advisor to the director of State Commission of Religious Affairs, Kyrgyzstan. We all know that extremism is also on the rise in Central Asia, and I read with great interest your findings about migrants from Kyrgyzstan who were not even particularly religious when they traveled to other countries to work, but then they were suddenly approachable by radical groups because they felt socially isolated or otherwise in need. So my question to you is, Kadir, can you explain what makes people sensitive or susceptible to radical ideas?
Of course.
What is there a thing, and maybe also the answer to that, is there such a thing as
you mean conditions,
immunization to that?
Conditions, some conditions for radicalization.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to express my gratitude to Dawood Moradi and his center. Thank you very much. This is discussion is very, very timely, I think. And let me, first of all,
هشت صبح دریچه خبر افغانستان.
د 8 صوب ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د 8 صوب ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ.
کانال واتساپ 8 صبح را دنبال کنید. ما تازه‌ترین رویدادهای خبری افغانستان، منطقه و جهان را به گونه موثق، متوازن و به موقع پوشش می‌دهیم. برای دسترسی آسان به رویدادهای خبری، گزارش‌ها و تحلیل‌ها، کانال 8 صبح را در واتساپ دنبال کنید و به اشتراک بگذارید.
من اون خوردن ندارم. چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختی هست.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از دامنه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب، اسپاتیفای، اپل میوزیک، گوگل پادکست و تریدز، خبرهای تازه، گزارش‌های ویژه، مستندهای کوتاه و تحلیل‌ها را در قالب پادکست به مخاطبان ارائه می‌کند. رویدادها بر سرنوشت شما تأثیر می‌گذارند. آنچه را می‌بینید با آنچه را می‌دانید روایت کنید. 8 صبح، روایت دیروز، آینه امروز، نوید فردا.
هشت صبح، دریچه خبر افغانستان.
د 8 صبح تلګرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان، سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د 8 صبح تلګرام چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ. د 8 صبح تلګرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان، سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د 8 صبح تلګرام
من اون خوردن ندارم. چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختیت.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از زمینه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب، اسپاتیفای، اپل میوزیک، گوگل پادکست و تریدز، خبرهای تازه، گزارش‌های ویژه، مستندهای کوتاه و تحلیل‌ها را در قالب پادکست به مخاطبان ارائه می‌کند. رویدادها بر سرنوشت شما تأثیر می‌گذارند. آنچه را می‌بینید با آنچه را می‌دانید روایت کنید. 8 صبح، روایت دیروز، آینه امروز، نوید فردا.
هشت صبح، دریچه خبر افغانستان.
من اون خوردن ندارم. چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختیت.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از زمینه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب، اسپاتیفای، اپل میوزیک، گوگل پادکست و تریدز، خبرهای تازه، گزارش‌های ویژه، مستندهای کوتاه و تحلیل‌ها را در قالب پادکست به مخاطبان ارائه می‌کند. رویدادها بر سرنوشت شما تأثیر می‌گذارند. آنچه را می‌بینید با آنچه را می‌دانید روایت کنید. 8 صبح، روایت دیروز، آینه امروز، نوید فردا.
د 8 صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان، سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صوب واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ. د هشت صوب واتس اپ چینل، د هشت صوب ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان، سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صوب ټلګرام چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ. د
هشت صبح دریچه خبر افغانستان.
من اون خوردن ندارم، چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختیت.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از دامنه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب.
It's unbelievable. But for me, again, it's not a surprise to hear this because he's part of this group, a paid agent of this group that supports never-ending wars all around the world. Part of that team created the mess in Afghanistan and now shamelessly repeating his lies in Tajikistan. And please, today I'm here just by chance and heard the arguments. And sometimes we're not here, or representatives of my country are not here. Just push back such nonsense claims saying that Turkey is facilitating ISIS. Turkey has been fighting ISIS and terrorist organizations for a long time. We, unlike other countries, put our soldiers' boots on the ground in Syria, fought face to face, not used proxies. We lost 100 soldiers, neutralized more than 3,000 ISIS militants. So I really, really regret to hear that individuals like Michael Rubin, an anti-Turkey lobbyist and a paid agent, given a platform to spread those lies in the heart of Central Asia. And you all know that my country has been standing with all those suffered from terrorism, from Palestine to Afghanistan, from Syria to other places. And this is not fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm surprised by this very, please stay for a second. Please stay for a second. I certainly wanted to give Michael Rubin the opportunity to answer. There were two major facts that were claimed that Turkey is providing a platform for terrorism, and at the same time that Michael Rubin is a paid agent. Maybe you want to answer that.
Personally, I admire the ambassador's passion. I'm a paid agent of no one. I speak what I see. The short answer to the ambassador's remarks would be, while Turkey has been victimized by terrorism, it's the same pattern that we've seen in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, where governments will seek to employ extremism for their foreign policy priorities and then suffer blowback. The victims to that are innocent Turks, and I regret that there's not the introspection within Turkish policy, and anyone who conducts such introspection is jailed, that we have to have this discussion the way we do rather than have much more civilized discourse.
I really appreciate that this is possible here to exchange different views, and I'm sorry that the ambassador left. I hope he's still hearing the answer. There's a gentleman in the very back. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. با تشکر از حضار محترم از سوالهای جهتدار و عمیقاً با پیشقضاوتی ناظم مجلس هم تشکر میکنم و هم تعجب میکنم. جای حیف است که وقت کافی برای دانشمندان محترم داده نشد تا در رابطه با آنچه اسلامیزم نامیده شد و در حوله از اسانسیالیزم تشریح شد، گویا که اسلامیزم فقط یک واژه با یک معنی و یک مفهوم است و باعث خلط مشکلات شد که در ضمن ناظم محترم جنگ زمینی ده، جنگ ضد کلونیالیسم که در فلسطین اجرا میشه او را هم در جنگ سیویلیزیشن و جنگ مذاهب خلط کرد و باعث تشویش بیشتر ما در این رابطه گردید. عرض می است که من 50 سال است که در رابطه با دین اسلامیزم کوشش میکنم معلومات پیدا بکنم و در طول 50 سال همان قدری که نقاط مشترکی را در رابطه با واژه اسلامیزم و جنبش های اسلامی پیدا کردیم، با اما اندازه نقاط افتراقی هم بین از اینا مشاهده میشه. کوبیدن، تعریف کردن، دفاع کردن از اسلامیزم و مثابه یک جریان واحد به نظر من خط بزرگی هست.
Sir, your question?
My question is آیا اسلامگرایی دکتر انور ابراهیم در مالزیا با اسلامگرایی در ایران شبیه هستند؟ یکسان است؟ آیا اسلامگرایی محترم رجب طایب اردوان با تحریک امارت اسلامی طالبان همسان است؟ خواهش میکنم در این رابطه یک مقدار عمق بیشتر و فهم بیشتر به کار ببرید. تشکر.
Unfortunately, thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, it's 6 o'clock now. So I just take this question and encourage everybody to have this conversation among you, because it's really a broader discussion. I ask you to very briefly give us one thought on our way to dinner. What would help to modernize Islamic civilization as we most likely all wish it to see in the future? Do you want to start? Very briefly, Nasreen.
To me, I think that it will help this week, next week, or United Nations elimination of violence against women, and it will help the Islamic civilization and the whole world if next year there is no violence against Afghan women. I pray to that.
If we want to modernize Islamic civilization, my suggestion is, in our part, as Muslims, we have to be courageous to go ahead for some fundamental reform about the theology, about the Sharia law, and about the human rights, and to open our arms and to hug the humanitarian civilizational experiences. But the other side, the superpowers also should help this process, not to damage or destroy it.
Thank you. Yes, Abdul Halik.
Yes. Very simple. Very simple for the Muslim countries, for the Muslim intellectual. We should open the door for a new wave of ijtihad. What do I mean by ijtihad is the movement, intellectual review for all the concepts prevailing the social and political system and in Muslim societies, and to create what we can say some kind of reform of our views regarding to the new developments we are living in. And this ijtihad is raised by a group since 25 years from different countries, but unsucceeded because the what we can say, the official religious establishment were against it, and the media also were against it. But I think this is the only way to reform our societies in accordance of a correct interpretation for Quran and Sunnah. And doesn't mean creating a new Islam, but this reform inside Islam. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
For me?
Yes, please.
I think this is my opinion of view. We must develop intellectual Islam. It means a scientific knowledge, skills of critical thinking, and comparative analysis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So actually, I learned a lot in this brief panel. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for all thoughts in the room. Michael, you said you would not want to say anything. Okay, no need. At the end, I would like to conclude that it needs a lot of efforts. We just heard intellectual review of the Quran and Islam as a way of life. Actually, it was not so far away from what Mr. Abdulhadi just said. It's actually an intellectual discussion about it. The absence of the impact of women obviously contributes to extremism. Scholars and authorities in the society need to stand up against radicals and be courageous, as we just heard. The interference of foreign countries and forces need to be cautious and sensitive, and productive, not counterproductive. So, and if this is all happening, we would see a beautiful renaissance of Islamic civilization. Thank you very much for your attention.
On that positive note, this concludes our today's event on former sessions. Tonight we'll have a poster performance at 7 p.m. here.
موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د هشت صبح واتس اپ چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ.
کانال تلگرام 8 صبح را دنبال کنید. ما تازه ترین رویدادهای خبری افغانستان، منطقه و جهان را به گونه موثق، متوازن و با موقع پوشش می دهیم. برای دسترسی آسان به رویدادهای خبری، گزارش‌ها و تحلیل‌ها، کانال 8 صبح را در تلگرام دنبال کنید و به اشتراک بگذارید.
هشت صبح دریچه خبر افغانستان.
کانال واتساپ 8 صبح را دنبال کنید. ما تازه ترین رویدادهای خبری افغانستان، منطقه و جهان را به گونه موثق، متوازن و با موقع پوشش می دهیم. برای دسترسی آسان به رویدادهای خبری، گزارش‌ها و تحلیل‌ها، کانال 8 صبح را در واتساپ دنبال کنید و به اشتراک بگذارید.
د 8 صبح تلگرام چینل وڅارئ. موږ د افغانستان سیمې او نړۍ وروستي خبرونه معتبر، متوازن او پر وخت خبرو. د خبري پیښو، راپورونو او تحلیلونو ته د اسانه لاسرسي لپاره د 8 صبح تلگرام چینل وڅارئ او خپور کړئ.
من اون خوردن ندارم. چی کنم؟
خب هر روز ما با سختی هست.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از دامنه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح در فیسبوک، اینستاگرام، توییتر، یوتیوب، اسپاتیفای، اپل میوزیک، گوگل پادکست و تریدز، خبرهای تازه، گزارش‌های ویژه، مستندهای کوتاه و تحلیل‌ها را در قالب پادکست به مخاطبان ارائه می‌کند. رویدادها بر سرنوشت شما تأثیر می‌گذارند. آنچه را می‌بینید با آنچه را می‌دانید روایت کنید. 8 صبح، روایت دیروز، آینه امروز، نوید فردا.